While Europe is not commonly associated with edible insects, the continent has produced several forms of arthropod cheese. I say arthropod because I am mostly referring to cheese mites, which are arachnids, not insects. These mites are attracted to the rinds of semi-hard cheeses, where they burrow into the rind and eat it. Some of these mites, like Acarus are pests of grains and would ruin infested flour or feed, but for cheese the effect is mixed. As the mites digest the cheese, they alter its flavor. The cheese dust found on the outside of mite-infested cheeses, containing living and dead mites plus their wastes, is only harmful if you are allergic to mites. While for Parmesan or cheddar such mites would be considered a contamination, for cheeses like Cantal or Salaire, natural mite infestations are seen as an improvement, and for the French cheese mimolette, mites are deliberately added to the outside of the cheese, as their digestion enhances the flavor. The German Milbenkäse requires mites to properly ripen. A soft German cheese called Quark is put into boxes of rye flour and mites for 3 months, during which time the cheese hardens and the mites give it a unique flavor. The resulting cheese is eaten with the mite dust on it. It's very hard to find. The technique for making mite cheese was almost lost to history until a chemistry teacher in a tiny village of Wurschwitz re-established the Milbenkäse industry. I had the pleasure of visiting his home where he makes the cheese, and which also houses the Cheese Mite Museum. One should note that other species of predatory mites will try to eat the cheese mites, so it's important to keep your cheese facility free of bad mites to protect the good ones. The most extreme case of arthropods in cheese is the Sardinian cheese Casu Marzu, literally rotten cheese, though this is actually just one of several Italian cheeses made the same way. To make them, hard pecorino cheese is deliberately infested with cheese flies, an insect that normally lays its eggs on dead bodies once they have reached the cheesy stage of putrefaction. The flies will gladly lay eggs on cheese, and the resulting maggots will digest it, breaking down the fats and making a softer, creamier cheese with an unmistakable flavor. Normally the cheese is eaten on bread with the maggots still alive, and because cheese fly larvae known as skippers are known to jump several centimeters when disturbed, you may have to hold your hand over the bread to keep them from jumping. Alternatively, you can kill the maggots by refrigeration or by suffocating them by putting the cheese in a paper bag and waiting for them to stop jumping. Despite being traditional, this cheese is currently illegal under EU food laws, though locals are hoping to change this. The single most important insect in the food industry is one you do not eat. Well, you can. Their larvae and pupae are edible, but that's not why it's important. I'm talking, of course, about the honeybee, and it is critical for much of the world's agriculture, specifically for pollination. Bees are among several insects that transport pollen between flowers, from the male anther to the female stigma. Once pollinated, the flower changes, as the sperm inside the pollen grain migrate to the ovaries inside the pistil and fertilize the plant, producing seeds and some nutritious material around them like fruits. Not all plants require insects to fertilize them. The most important crops for humanity, like wheat, corn, rice, and soy, are pollinated by the wind. Of the rest, some are pollinated by larger animals, like birds or bats, and some are pollinated by other insects. Cacao, from which chocolate is made, and the tea plant are pollinated by flies, not bees. So if bees went extinct, would they take humanity along with them? No. All of the staple crops would remain, and we'd still have chocolate, thankfully. But the variety and flavor options of our diets would fall. We'd lose out on most fruits, nuts, vegetables, and spices, as well as cotton, sunflower, coffee, and alfalfa, which is important for feeding cows. But which bees? There are actually over 16,000 species of bees, most of which you have probably never seen or heard of, but nearly all of which pollinate something. This includes bumblebees in the genus Bombus, which are important pollinators for tomatoes and berries. Apples are typically pollinated by orchard bees like Osmia lignaria, and alfalfa is pollinated mostly by the alfalfa leafcutter bee, Megachila rotundata. There are sweat bees, orchid bees, carpenter bees, and mason bees. Some are solitary, some are social. In the tropics, you have stingless bees, the meliponines, that pollinate tropical trees. These native bees are still very important, and many of them are threatened. The vanilla orchid bee, for example, is almost extinct, so most vanilla must be hand-pollinated. The bees most people think of when they think of bees are the honeybees, usually the Western or European honeybee Apis mellifera. Domesticated for several millennia, this is the bee most commonly kept by beekeepers around the world, primarily for pollination. It's not the only honeybee, as others such as Apis cerana are more common in East Asia, for example. But it is the bee we will be discussing from this point onward. Briefly, here's how beekeeping works. The bees are social insects and will build a colony or hive in any large enough chamber, filling it with wax cells called honeycomb. Humans have invented artificial beehive boxes that are ideal for bees and make it easier for the beekeeper to handle the colonies. Each colony has a queen, the mother of all the other bees, who lays the eggs that become larvae, pupae, and eventually adult bees. The adult worker bees, all of which are female, go out to flowers and gather pollen and nectar, in the process transporting some pollen between the flowers, pollinating them. Modern-day beekeepers use migratory hives, transporting hives across great distances on trucks, bringing them from orchard to orchard, field to field, as different plants are in bloom and different farmers are willing to pay for pollination services. This pollination is the biggest boon of bees to society, and the reason why people love them so, though again, there are plenty of non-domesticated native bees that deserve recognition for their pollination services too, and are likely in more need of protection than the domesticated European honeybee. So what do bees do with the nectar that they collect from flowers, pollinating them in the process? The nectar is stored by bees in their social stomach, or honey stomach, and back in the hive, gets vomited out into special cells in the honeycomb, along with salivary enzymes. Younger adult worker bees then fan the nectar to dehydrate it, and the enzymes inside work to convert the sucrose of the nectar into fructose and glucose sugars. This concentrated fermented bee vomit is the delicacy known as honey, easily the most delicious of the fermented animal vomits. Honeybees are not the only bees that make honey. The stingless bees in the tropics make honey, but their hives are disorganized and much harder to extract honey from. The benefit of Apis mellifera hives is that it is quite easy to extract the honey from the honeycomb all at once. The modern beehive, also known as the Langstroth hive after the priest who designed it in the 1800s, has multiple movable frames, each of which the bees will fill with honeycomb, but which are separated by just enough space that the bees will leave it alone, neither filling it with comb nor sealing it shut. The frames can thus be taken in and out of the hive without having to cut anything, and importantly, without harming any bees. No bee has to die in the production of honey. What about the bee larvae and pupae? These come from eggs laid by the queen, who is considerably fatter than the other bees. By use of a special mesh called the queen extruder, a beekeeper can ensure that the queen stays in a certain part of the hive, meaning some frames will contain her brood, while the others contain nothing but harvestable honey. The beekeeper will use smoke to pacify the bees, a hive tool to lightly pry out the frames, a bee brush to gently brush the bees off, and a wax melter and centrifuge to collect the honey, then return the comb to the hive to be refilled by the bees. There are several misconceptions about honey that I would like to take the time to correct for you here. First of all, honey harvesting does not harm bees. Again, no bees, larval or adult, are harmed in the process of honey harvesting. Most managed beehives typically produce too much honey, becoming honey-bound, meaning there is not enough room for the queen to lay her eggs. Harvesting the honey is good for the bees, not bad. Beekeepers take good care of their hives, like a pet owner taking care of their beloved pets, and always try to do what is best for their bees. So is honey vegan? While most vegans will say no, most beekeepers will say it should be, and that vegans who refuse to eat honey are being hypocrites. After all, they have no problems eating fruits and vegetables pollinated by farmed bees, so why shouldn't they eat the honey made by the same bees in the process? Is honey healthful? There are countless alleged health benefits to honey, with some people even claiming honey is good for diabetics. All lies. Honey is concentrated sugar, more dense than table sugar. It's a mixture of fructose and glucose, like a mixture of corn syrup and table sugar. If you wouldn't use corn syrup and table sugar to cure or treat an illness, then don't expect honey to have magical medicinal properties either. The few non-sugar compounds in honey are there in such trace amounts that they have absolutely no effect on human health. So no, adding honey to your diet is not going to improve your health any more than adding corn syrup and table sugar would. And replacing sugar with honey won't help you either. If anything, it will make your health worse, or at least make you fatter. Honey is not good for diabetics, and it is not a health food. On the contrary, honey can be dangerous. Honey can contain spores of Clostridium botulinum, which, while mostly harmless in an adult gut, can sporulate in the guts of babies and cause botulism, which can lead to problems like floppy baby syndrome and even death. Never give honey or honey products to a child younger than 1 year old. Another myth is the idea of raw honey. This is honey that is unfiltered and unpasteurized, and so is being marketed as being natural and healthy. Again, no honey is healthful, it's just sugar. Filtering the honey removes some of the larger honey crystals and trace impurities and makes it easier to squeeze out, while pasteurization kills toxic yeast spores that can make anyone sick. Pasteurization is a good thing. Raw, natural, or organic honey are at best overpriced honeys marketed to celebrate gullible people from their money. And worse, are going to make them deathly ill in the process. Don't buy them, and don't believe everything you read on the internet. Similarly, the web is full of different tips and tricks that claim to help you separate pure or natural honey from fake or adulterated honey. Now, it is true that some products that look like honey are actually diluted or mixed with corn syrup. But there are no reliable ways to test for this. How honey looks, the way it pours, the way it crystallizes, depends more on its temperature, as honey naturally crystallizes between 10 and 21 degrees Celsius. There is no reliable way to test at home if honey was adulterated. The only guaranteed way to know is to read the label. In any country with proper food regulatory bodies like the USA, the label will clearly tell you whether the product is pure honey or a honey blend or honey-flavored syrup. By law, they cannot lie and have no motivation to, since again, there's no benefit to honey compared to corn syrup and table sugar. The ingredients list on the label is trustworthy. The internet is not. Honey is not the only product people can harvest from honey bees. In fact, there are many such products. There's the bee brood, or larvae and pupae, which can be eaten. There's the bee's wax, produced from glands on the bee's body and used to make the comb and cap the comb cells. These caps will be removed during honey harvesting. Beeswax is an incredibly useful substance. It is non-digestible, meaning it passes through your digestive system. No positive or negative health effects. This makes it perfectly safe to use in food, in chewing gum, glazes, and as a coating for cheeses and drug capsules. It's also safe for cosmetics like hair wax and lip gloss. It can be used to make candle wax, surfboard wax, rosin for string instruments, shoe polish. It's used in arts like batik fabric dyeing and lost wax casting. Check your home right now. You probably have something made with beeswax in it. If you want a fun assignment, go to a store and check the candies and cosmetics for beeswax in the ingredients. You may be surprised by how many goods use this insect product. A mixture of beeswax and bee saliva is bee glue, also known as propolis. Propolis is what bees use to seal any small gaps in the hive that are too small for a bee to crawl through. It too can be harvested and is used in traditional Chinese medicines and as an additive to some products like mouthwash and toothpaste, though there's no actual strongly supported evidence that it has any effects on humans. Again, beeswax is non-digestible, and propolis is just beeswax hardened with bee spit. Its use in cosmetics is probably just a way to attract customers who think bee products are healthy. A more responsible use of propolis is for its shine. Car wax and violin varnish are made with propolis. That means you can honor the honeybee in 3 ways by playing Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight on the Bumblebee on a propolis-varnished violin with a beeswax rosined bow. What about the pollen? Honeybees do collect pollen for their own uses. It's mostly sugar, but does have a little bit of protein that growing bees need. The foraging workers don't store it in their stomach, but in special pollen baskets on their legs. Collecting pollen is messy work, so some pollen will end up on their head or body and eventually transferred accidentally to the next flower they visit, causing pollination. When the bees return home, they mix this pollen with some nectar from their stomach, which contains lactic acid bacteria. This is covered with a drop of honey to seal out air, producing an anaerobic environment in which the pollen and nectar mixture ferments into something called bee bread, which lasts longer and is higher in nutrients for the bees, and which also means bees can cook, which I think is pretty wild. Both pollen and bee bread can be eaten by humans. Bee bread must be taken from the combs, while pollen can be collected using a pollen trap at the entrance to the hive that knocks the pollen off the pollen baskets as the bees try to squeeze through the trap to enter the hive. Both are mostly sugar, and so are used as sweeteners and can be found in health food stores. Like most items sold in health food stores, they have absolutely no benefit to human health. Not a thing. They're mostly sugar. There's nothing in these products that you can't get from normal food. Oh, and if you happen to have a pollen allergy, that applies to eating pollen as well as breathing it in. Pollen and bee bread really should be left for the bees. Similarly, you may find royal jelly supplements at health food stores. Royal jelly is a chemical secreted by glands of the worker bees and fed to the bee larvae. Those destined to become future queens get extra helpings, as the additional sugar and a protein called royalactin stimulate their development into a reproductive caste. Once again, royal jelly has absolutely no benefits to human health and can trigger allergic reactions in some people. You are not a bee larva. You cannot buy your way to health with overpriced supplements that are mostly sugar and allergens. Recently, I saw some places are selling drone pupa extract. Now this is just getting silly. People, please stop grinding up bees into fake health foods. A gym membership and up-to-date vaccinations are going to do a lot more for your health than bottled bee excretion. An insect product you are more likely to have eaten than heard of is cochineal, also known as carmine, natural red number 4, or E120. It's a natural food coloring produced from an insect, Dactylopius coccus, the American cactus cochineal bug. They feed on Opuntia cactus, traditionally farmed by the Zapotec Indians of Mexico and still farmed today in Oaxaca, plus Peru, Chile, and the Canary Islands. Either the cactus is left alone to be infested naturally by these otherwise pest insects, or they are added deliberately to the cactus. The infested plants are protected from the cold and rain for about 90 days until they are harvested by brushing the insects off. The body of a cochineal bug is 17 to 24% carminic acid, a bright red dye that can be used both as a food coloring and to dye clothes or cosmetics such as lipsticks. Many red foods, such as strawberry-flavored anything, ruby red grapefruit drinks, maraschino cherries, and the beverage Campari, either are or traditionally were colored with carmine. Depending on how the insects are removed or killed, such as whether they were sun-dried or boiled, the color can be slightly different. Boil powdered insect and add special salts and you get carmine lake, a different dye used in paintings, fabric, printing, and histology. The history of dyes and pigments is worth a course on its own, but suffice it to say that cochineal's importance as a red dye is significant. A few European bugs did produce red pigments used in ancient times, but American cochineal quickly took over. Today in Mexico, cochineal farming is seen as a social good, lowering poverty and improving the livelihoods of women who farm it. In other parts of the world, less so. The cactus and the cochineal bug were introduced in Australia to set up their own carmine industry, but the insects died off, and the Opuntia cactus became a widespread weed. In Ethiopia, a carmine business established in 2009 failed after a year, and the insects moved on to eat native plants, becoming a pest. Cochineal dye is mostly safe, although some people are allergic to it, which is why it must be identified in ingredients lists typically as carmine. It's also not vegan. It can take up to 100,000 insects to make just 1 kilogram of dye. For these two reasons, artificial alternatives to carmine have been invented. The names used for these dyes are confusing, as different countries have their own naming systems. The most common red dye in the world today is Red 40 or E129, a dye made from coal tar that is banned in some EU countries, while the dye New Coquine or E124 is not approved in the USA. So next time someone tells you they prefer natural food coloring over artificial, you can tell them what natural red really means. Not to be confused with lacquer, which comes from a tree, lac is a resin secreted by tiny lac insects like Caryolaca, native to India and nearby parts of Asia. The insect feeds on the sap of certain trees like pigeon pea, and moving infected sticks from one tree to another can quickly produce large amounts of infested branches covered with thousands of tiny insects. These branches, called sticklac, are dried in the sun to kill the insects, then crushed, sieved, and washed to get seedlac. The seedlac can be used as is or heated in a canvas tube until a pure substance called shellac emerges, that is dried and broken into flakes. Dissolve this in a solvent and you get liquid shellac. It is possible to let the insects escape their resinous homes before you process the sticklac, and the resulting lac will be relatively pure. Like cochineal, the lac insects contain a red chemical, so lac made with the insects still inside can be used as a red dye. It's edible and still used today mostly in India, in some soft drinks, candies, jams, and sauces, though it's primarily used to color fabric, like leather, wool, and silk. Lac and shellac have many other uses. Indian jewelry, namely bangles, are made of lac, and lac was also used to make the music records before the invention of vinyl. Sealing wax, nail polish, and wood finish used in violins and furniture are also made of shellac. Shellac is non-digestible and inert, meaning it passes through your digestive system, and so it can be used in foods and cosmetics as well, like hairspray and mascara. Along with beeswax, shellac can be used as confectioner's glaze, used to give candies their shiny color. Jelly beans and candy corn, for example, typically contain shellac. The wax coating on fruits like apples and citrus that gives them a shiny appearance will also often be a thin layer of shellac. Pharmaceutical glaze is also shellac, used to give medicines a shiny coating and to make time-release capsules. Again, lac is not vegan. A kilogram of lac requires between 50 to 300,000 insects. In the Indian number system, a lac is 100,000, named after how numerous these insects are. Silkworm pupae are probably the oldest edible insects to be farmed, though obviously they aren't farmed as food. Rather, the edible pupa is a delicious byproduct of the production of silk, an ancient but still very important fabric. Tens of thousands of tons of silk are produced every year, as the fabric is shiny and lustrous, warm yet lightweight, strong and durable. It's used not only in fabrics for clothing, but also in furnishings, parachutes, and even as sutures for stitching wounds. That's because silk is covered in a protein called sericin that happens to be useful in wound healing and which naturally resists infections. The main silk producer and source of edible pupae is Bombyx mori, an insect that humans have domesticated for so long that they now fully depend on us for survival. They have lost their natural colors and lost the ability to fly, and so cannot reproduce without human help. The basics of silkworm production, or sericulture, have not changed too much over the last few thousand years. Silkworm caterpillars must be fed mulberry leaves, and when they have matured, the caterpillar will spin a single cocoon from a single filament of silk, inside which it will pupate and eventually form an adult. Normally, the adult will break a hole in the cocoon to escape. Instead, a silk farmer will boil the cocoon to kill the pupa, and then brush the cocoon to find the outside end of the silk filament, and reel it up as a single mile-long piece. The resulting pupae, conveniently already boiled, can then be processed as food. 48 such filaments make a single thread of silk, so it takes over 1,100 silkworm pupae to make a kilogram of raw silk. That's a lot of pupae, so it's a good thing they are edible, even if they aren't nearly as valuable as their cocoons. Bombyx mori isn't the only silkworm. Non-domesticated silk moths like Attacus atlas or Antherea asamensis have different silks, with different colors and properties. One worth mentioning is Samiocinthia, the Alianthus silk moth. The larvae of this species feed on castor plants, or eri in Assamese, and the resulting eri silk is darker, heavier, and warmer than regular silk, though it is not reeled as a single filament and has to be spun into thread the way wool or cotton are. Importantly, the larva spins its cocoon with a natural opening, so the moth can leave the cocoon as an adult without damaging the silk. This means no insects have to die to make eri silk, giving it the nickname of ahimsa silk, or the fabric of peace. It is the fabric of choice for Buddhist monks who practice non-violence. Insects aren't the only animals who make silk. What about spiders? Spider silk is hard to harvest. It's either taken from old cobwebs or slowly spooled out from the living spider. This is possible, and a very elegant dress made from the silk of the golden orb weaver was displayed in 2012, although it took several years to harvest the silks from over 1 million spiders from Madagascar in order to make the piece. The more traditional use of spider silk was to make the reticles on optical devices, such as crosshairs on a weapon sight. This is because spider silk has a high tensile strength, meaning it won't break when pulled from both ends, and so can be stretched taut and hold its shape. Spider silk can also absorb 10 times as much energy as Kevlar. For this reason, spider silk is an interesting potential material for use in body armor, implant coatings, and maybe even artificial skin. But for that we need a better source of it than spiders. Today, genetically modified bacteria can produce the proteins found in spider silk, with the hope that we will eventually find a way to mass-produce spider silk and start making these futuristic fabrics. What happens to all the waste produced from insect production? The manure of livestock is a significant amount of waste, loaded with nitrogen and other nutrients that would ideally be returned to the soil, but also full of noxious microbes that we definitely do not want in our drinking water. Manure is most commonly used as a fertilizer, and it's a high-quality one at that. The same applies to insect manure, commonly referred to as frass, the solid pellets or powders excreted out of an insect's anus. They too can easily be used as plant fertilizer, and you can already buy bags of cricket frass from cricket farmers for this use. The indigested food and frass left behind from black soldier fly farming is similarly used as fertilizer. But of the over 1 million species of insects out there, a few make poops with more interesting uses. The waste of honeybees is, for now, not used in human products. Along with other refuse from the hive, it's called slum gum, and it's used either as fertilizer or bee attractant. Put a little slum gum into an empty hive, and soon other bees will smell it and establish a new hive there. The most valuable edible frass of insects comes from Andracathea, a moth whose caterpillars feed on the tea plant. Boiled, dried tea leaves are sprayed with rice water to attract the adult moths, who lay eggs on the tea leaves that become caterpillars. As these caterpillars have eaten nothing but tea leaves their whole lives, their frass is thus mostly tea, and can be used as such. Insect poop tea is used the same way as any other tea, but with a stronger flavor and more nutrients. It's also more expensive, as it takes 10 kilograms of leaves and a year of time to get 1 kilogram of frass. If you think paying extra to drink poop is weird, don't look up what civet coffee is. The frass of silkworms is another abundant waste product from the silk industry. It is used in traditional Chinese medicines, often as a filling for pillows, to dispel wind and relieve rheumatism. It's also high in chlorophyll, the green pigment found in plants, and also used as a green food coloring, E140. Add copper to it and you get chlorophyllin, a green food dye also known as natural green 3, or E141. Silkworm frass-derived chlorophyll and chlorophyllin are used in supplements and alternative medicines in China, though at this point in time they are not legal in the EU or USA. Many insects that eat a liquid diet of plant sap do not produce hard frass, but a liquid waste called honeydew that's very sweet. If enough insects are present making honeydew, a sticky residue appears that can be collected. The biblical manna from heaven that appeared to the Israelites on their exodus from Egypt is hypothesized to be the honeydew of local Hemiptera. Some insects in the Psyllidae family build little protective houses from these sugary secretions called lerps, which will be found on the underside of leaves where they live and can be collected in large amounts as a sweetener. Many lerps can be found on eucalyptus trees and were a traditional food for some Australian Aboriginal people. The mopane tree has its own psyllid with an edible lerp as well. One more insect-related substance I want to mention are galls. Galls are unusual tumor-like growths on plants, some of which are produced by insects. Gall wasps, for example, will sting the plants, and their venom triggers the plant into making a gall, into which the wasp lays its eggs. Galls have a tough outer covering that protects the living larva inside from enemies and provides it with lots of nutritious plant matter to feed on. Some galls have industrial uses. Oak galls, for example, were a source of black ink. In Australia, some trees have edible galls. The mulga apple and bush coconut are both tree galls that are either eaten themselves or picked open to harvest the insect inside. Recall that one of Vincent Holt's hypotheses for why people in Europe stopped eating insects is that they stopped using insects in medicine, having moved on to plant extracts and eventually synthetic versions with better safety and efficacy. Indeed, in communities that still consume a large variety of insects, many are also eaten for medicinal purposes. Without going too much into whether or not they work, here are a few examples. In traditional Chinese medicine, black ants in the genus Polyrhachis are highly valued as a general tonic, prescribed mainly for arthritis, hepatitis, and erectile dysfunction. Worldwide, ants have been prescribed as medicines for almost everything, most notably stomachache, cough, cold, and other conditions that usually go away if you do nothing. In modern China, a tonic made of powdered American cockroach, Periplaneta americana, is a prescription-only medicine for burns and stomach problems. The pharmaceutical company selling the tonic currently runs the world's largest computer-operated cockroach farm. Worldwide, cockroaches have had many uses, for boils in ancient Rome, the flu in Peru, and urine problems in Russia. A famous drug from Chinese and Tibetan medicine is Ophiocordyceps sinensis, a parasitic fungus that infests certain caterpillars that live in the Himalayan mountains. The stiff bodies of the caterpillar with the fungus fruiting body emerging out of it are extremely expensive, as they must be harvested by hand and are currently endangered, yet an important source of income in rural Tibet. Seen as a mixture of plant and animal, yin and yang, cordyceps is used as an anti-aging tonic. Note that we can actually grow the cordyceps mushroom by itself, and its effects are the same as the caterpillar version, while lower in heavy metals and lower in price. Now, let's talk sex. Nearly every organism on Earth has, by one culture or another, been prescribed for erectile dysfunction, especially the phallic-shaped ones. Mantis egg case in Korea, red velvet mite in India, the pronotal horn of a specific scarab beetle in Mexico. None of them actually work. But one has an interesting history. The Spanish fly, actually a blister beetle, Lida vesicatoria, which produces a chemical called cantharidin. If it touches your skin, it causes burns and blisters. If you eat the beetle, you get bleeding of the mucosa, damage to the digestive and urinary system, kidney failure, and, yes, an uncontrollable erection. Did people use this insect as a sex drug historically? Yes. Was it dangerous? Absolutely. Many people died from consumption of blister beetle, and it is now very much illegal. Stick to the little blue pill, gentlemen. It works, and it doesn't kill people. Another example of a dangerous insect medicine is apitherapy, the use of bee venom as an anti-inflammatory medicine for arthritis or multiple sclerosis. Sometimes this involves injecting bee venom, sometimes this involves using actual bees, like living acupuncture needles. The science says it doesn't work. Bee venom damages joints, makes MS actively worse, and yes, kills people. Even if you don't have a history of bee allergies, an allergy can develop at any time. In 2018, a 55-year-old woman from Spain died from bee acupuncture. She had been doing it for 2 years, but eventually developed a fatal allergy and died in the clinic. How about wounds? We already discussed that silkworm silk is used in sutures, and traditionally cobwebs could also be used as emergency bandages. You may have heard that honey is effective for wounds and burns. This is mostly because the sugar in honey dehydrates bacteria, but we have better options for wounds. The actual evidence for honey and honey bandages is low quality and weak. The consensus is that regardless of the kind of honey used, honey bandages do not work better than regular antiseptics and dressing. Again, honey is sugar, not medicine. However, there is one traditional insect therapy still used today that may surprise and possibly disgust you, but it really does work. It's called maggot therapy. The idea is simple. If a person has a large open wound, allow corpse flies to lay eggs in it and infest it. These are corpse maggots. They only eat dead flesh, so they will eat the dead necrotic tissue and leave the healthy tissue alone, a process called debridement that doctors do when cleaning large wounds, but which the maggots, with their tiny mouthparts, do much better. Maggots produce their own antibiotics, disinfecting wounds and keeping them clean. This traditional therapy was rediscovered in the 1860s and 1910s, as wartime doctors noticed soldiers with maggot-infested wounds survived more than those with uninfested wounds. Today, sterile farmed maggots of Lucilia sericata are sold as medicinal maggots, applied in sterile bandages to clean the wound and improve healing. Should you ever need maggot therapy, just think of them as teeny tiny surgeons, or try not to think about them at all. The cosmetics industry has been paying more and more attention to insects and other terrestrial arthropods. You may have already seen snail slime facial masks in stores if you live in a place where facial masks are a thing. Though again, snails are not arthropods, and certainly honey and beeswax and other bee products have been used in cosmetics for a long time. We are seeing a lot of different products emerging now, as insect products are no longer seen as a taboo. Scarab beetle protein, cricket oil, black soldier fly oil, centipede venom. Strange things are finding their ways into high-end cosmetics. Do any of these products actually work, or are they just another way to make money off of these creatures that are already being produced? Some of these uses are based in at least some science. Sericin, the protein in silkworm silk, does seem to affect wound healing positively, so it could theoretically have desirable effects on healthy skin. Others, I think, are arising out of opportunity. For example, I lived in Taiwan before and after the 2019 law legalizing the use of propolis and other bee products in foods and cosmetics. No sooner had the law passed than suddenly propolis was everywhere, in toothpastes, in mouthwashes, in soaps, in facial masks. Is there a benefit to it? No, it's inert. But people like bees, and like the idea of a product that contains bee-related substances in it. Many of these additives are what people in the industry call fairy dust, a substance that doesn't actually do anything, at least not in the doses provided in the products, but which, by sprinkling just a teeny bit of it into the product, you can attract a lot of customers and charge a much higher price. A good example of this is vitamins in shampoo. Your hair cannot absorb vitamins. Hair's dead. It's inert protein. But by putting vitamins in the shampoo, and therefore on the label, companies can make the product seem healthful and beneficial for hair, even though the vitamins have absolutely no effect on the hair or body whatsoever. It's a scam, and a very lucrative one. This doesn't mean all insect or plant-based products, for that matter, are bullplop. Many arthropods are chemically defended, and these chemicals thus have a clear effect on living tissue. Maybe they have beneficial uses. Bioprospecting is the science of checking the natural world for chemicals that have an actual positive effect on the body, or a negative effect on pathogens or diseases that affect us. Venoms that target nerves could be good sources of painkillers, while cytotoxic venoms that destroy cells could be used for cancer medication. An example of bioprospecting in action is parectadiol, a chemical found in the defensive secretions of the stick insect Parectadosoma macarici. This chemical causes your skin to turn red and peel, but it's painless. The insect is not edible, and it's not used in any traditional medicine. But scientists were curious how its defense system works. They discovered that parectadiol is chemically very similar to another chemical, parallyl alcohol, that is already being used to treat skin cancer. And so they are looking closer at the insect compound to see how its medicinal properties compare. Now, it's surprisingly easy to do bad science and say, yes, this insect oil has this effect on a few mice when applied in massive doses, and therefore if you eat it, it will cure cancer, or if you rub it on your face, you will look younger. But actually confirming these claims with rigorous experiments is harder. For medicines, rigorous testing is mandatory, and so it takes months or years of tests and millions of dollars in research to prove that a drug is both safe and effective. For supplements and cosmetics, none of that is necessary, and it certainly isn't done for alternative medicine and snake oil. So a package of makeup can say almost anything legally, and none of it has to be true. An example here is VAAM, or Vespa amino acid mixture, also known as hornet juice. Entomologists observed that adult Vespa mandarinia, the giant Asian hornet or murder hornet, consume the saliva of their larvae, which is unusual. The saliva contains a blend of common amino acids that can be synthesized in a lab, and this is sold in energy drinks and as a sports supplement. Does it work? Well, first, there's nothing inside VAAM that you couldn't find inside a steak or in tofu. It's just amino acids. Second, while controlled studies confirmed that VAAM supplements significantly improved the performance of wasps, they didn't do much to humans. If VAAM was actually a performance-enhancing drug, the Olympics would ban it. They haven't because it isn't. It's just a product riding on the wasp mania of the time. So don't automatically believe everything you hear about something being beneficial because it has so-and-so plant, animal, or fungal extract in it. Anyone can claim that something is good for a certain medical condition, but not everyone is legally required to prove it. False advertising on supplements and cosmetics is not illegal. As they say in Latin, caveat emptor, buyer beware. We have already talked about some of the important services living farmed insects do for humans. Pollination is certainly one of the biggest, and bioconversion of waste is rapidly growing. Even if you don't use the resulting insects as food or feedstock, the elimination and decontamination of their waste is a vital service. An excellent example is Australia. Cattle are not native to Australia, so when Europeans brought cows over, the native insect fauna were unable to process all that cow manure, leading to eruptions of Australian bushfly populations. To solve the problem, dung beetles from South Africa, Europe, and Hawaii were imported to Australia, with the hopes that some would successfully colonize and control the dung problem, burying the waste so the bushflies couldn't access it. The project was a success. A very significant positive use of insects in agriculture is the use of predatory or parasitoid insects as biocontrol for pests. Insect biocontrol deserves a class of its own to discuss properly. But suffice it to say, a lot of research is being done on ways to farm these different carnivorous insects more efficiently. There is one example of a crop where having pests is a good thing. Oriental beauty tea, also known as white-tip oolong. First discovered and developed in Taiwan, the tea plant is naturally infested with a leafhopper, Jacobiasca formosana. When the insect feeds on tea, the plant responds by producing chemicals that oxidize the leaves, giving them characteristic white tips and a unique taste. Insect farms have their uses in science and medicine. Medicinal maggots are one example, as are using insects as bioreactors. In traditional Chinese and Korean medicines, silkworms are deliberately infested with a pathogenic fungus, Beauveria bassiana, which has medicinal properties. Insects can also be used to produce vaccines, in the same way chicken eggs are used. A vaccine for canine eczema called Interdog is produced in silkworms, and stable insect cell lines were used to make the Chinese COVID-19 vaccine. Insects also have a long use in research, most famously Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly used for pioneering genetic studies. Insects are also entertaining. Butterflies are beautiful, ant farms are fascinating, and beetles are big money. In Japan, Taiwan, and Thailand, the rearing and trade of gigantic rhinoceros and stag beetles is a big industry, with beetle shops selling beetles and beetle accessories, easy to find in big cities, and international trade of questionable legality and environmental risk definitely occurring. Some of these beetles will fight, which is entertaining to watch. Crickets are another traditional pet in East Asia. Some kept for their song, others kept as fighters, with cricket fighting still practiced in China today, though there is a risk that some populations known for producing top-tier fighters are being over-harvested. What new possibilities exist for insect farmers? Could cricket fights experience a renaissance now that cricket farming goes international? Could insect foot massages become a thing? Let's leave that to your imaginations. While sustainability and resource conservation are becoming ever more important concerns for people on Earth, in space they are critical. On a space station above the Earth or a future space vessel traveling across the planets, every resource must be rationed and utilized carefully. For their high conversion efficiency and small size requirements, insects have already been identified as a possible protein source for space farming. What kind of animals can be farmed in space? First, to get them off the Earth, they have to be light and easy to transport. They need to be small, taking up as little space as possible. They should use a minimal amount of water or oxygen, as those would need to be brought up from Earth and need to be shared with the human astronauts. They also need to be able to survive in zero gravity. This is harder than it seems. Quails, for example, cannot drink water without gravity, as Soviet cosmonauts found out in 1990, when quails hatched on board the Mir space station were unable to feed themselves. And adult quails, for whatever reason, experience reductions in their reproductive organs and will not mate in microgravity. Other animals brought on space stations include fish and snails, both of which can reproduce without gravity, but which have a disadvantage of wasting resources on bones and shells, respectively. In the economy of space, where every kilogram of material brought from Earth to orbit costs thousands of US dollars, any inedible parts of an animal are an expensive waste. Enter insects, which, among all the other benefits we discussed in this course, can also be eaten whole with nothing wasted. In 2016, Chinese taikonauts took several silkworms up into space, along with mulberry-flavored leaves for them to eat, and found that, even in microgravity, the larvae could spin cocoons. I give this example of insects as astronaut food to remind you that the promotion of insect farming isn't just a response to doom and gloom predictions about the climate and fate of livestock, nor is it all about the foods from history and traditional cultures at risk of being lost. Edible insects, as food or feed or other purposes, are part of the past, present, and future of mankind's cuisine. No matter where you are on Earth or far above Earth, there could be a delectable insect dish that's just right for you.